the aftermath of World War II, millions of pages of intelligence files were sealed, stamped, and hidden away from public eyes. Buried deep in Allied Axis and Soviet archives, they tell a story that never appeared in the official histories or the triumphant speeches of generals. These documents describe secret alliances forged in the shadows, covert bargains struck in smoke-filled rooms, and operations erased from public record with the stroke of a pen. Entire networks of influence, stretching from Vatican corridors to Siberian labor camps, were carefully concealed, protected not only by governments, but also by institutions that could not afford to have their reputations stained by wartime complicity. What remains in these forgotten files is not simply the tale of armies and battles, but of betrayals, clandestine pacts, and experiments conducted on entire populations without their knowledge. The truth was judged too volatile, too corrosive to the post-war order, and so it was locked away. Sealed in vaults in Washington, Moscow, London, and Tokyo, these files sat in silence, waiting for time and chance to pry them open. What emerges now are fragments of a hidden war, evidence of operations that shaped the Cold War before it began, and alliances that compromised the moral high ground claimed by victors. These are not rumors, nor are they inventions. They are whispers preserved in carbon copies of field reports, coded intercepts, and trial transcripts that were never meant to see daylight. Once uncovered, they paint a chilling portrait of a world that chose silence over truth. Chapter 1. The Vatican's Shadow War Network. From the earliest days of the Reich's collapse in 1945, fragments of evidence began to circulate within Allied intelligence bureaus, hinting at an escape network so vast and sophisticated it rivaled official supply chains. It would come to be known, in whispers across OSS offices and MI6 safehouses, as the Rat Line. Though outwardly portrayed as humanitarian assistance to displaced persons in a Europe torn apart by war, its true function lay in the systematic exfiltration of high-ranking Nazi officials, SS doctors and intelligence officers wanted for war crimes. Buried in the correspondence of Gestapo File No. 712AX and a series of intercepted Vatican communiques, investigators found the fingerprints of a covert alliance between clerical authorities, sympathetic diplomats, and elements of Western intelligence who saw in these men not criminals, but assets for the coming struggle against communism. The center of gravity was Rome, a city cloaked in chaos after liberation. Refugees surged into makeshift camps, their papers forged, their names altered. Among them, under the protective shadow of ecclesiastical robes, walked figures like SS officer Klaus Barbie, later dubbed the Butcher of Lyon. His escape was neither accidental nor improvised. It was orchestrated. Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima, emerges repeatedly in declassified interrogation transcripts. Hudal, fluent in German and well-connected within both Vatican and Austrian circles, used his influence to secure international Red Cross travel documents. These documents, stamped with the authority of neutral organizations, were virtually unquestionable. With them, men who had overseen massacres in Eastern Europe boarded trains south, slipping through Genoa's harbors onto ships bound for Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. The language of the files is clinical, but the human consequences are chilling. OSS Report X-220 from late 1946 describes the arrival of cargo in Buenos Aires. Not weapons, not gold, but men. They carried with them not only the scars of war but intelligence dossiers, knowledge of Soviet positions, experimental weapons research, and interrogation methods. The United States, engaged in the first cold confrontations with Moscow, saw utility in sparing such men from justice. Operation Paperclip had already formalized the recruitment of German scientists into American aerospace and chemical programs. What the Vatican corridor provided was parallel, a clandestine human reservoir for ideological and technical expertise, though shrouded beneath layers of religious immunity. The geography of the Rat Line reveals deliberate planning. The route often began in Austria, passing through Salzburg and Innsbruck into northern Italy. Safe houses operated under monastic cover, their residents disguised as humble brothers in prayer. Once in Rome, the fugitives sought audience with sympathetic clergy. Files reference the use of the Collegio Teutonico and convents near Via della Conciliazione as temporary sanctuaries. Couriers carrying diplomatic pouches between Rome and Bern ensured the flow of identity documents, while select elements of the Swiss Guard, sworn to protect the papacy, were implicated as silent escorts. In one intercepted telegram from late 1947, the code phrase, "Shepherd's flock moving south," signaled the transport of a group of 6 former SS officers to Genoa, their passage facilitated by Franciscan friars stationed near the port. The Vatican's role remains one of calculated ambiguity. No papal decree ordering such operations has ever been uncovered. Yet silence at the highest levels amounted to complicity. Pope Pius V, revered for his spiritual leadership, has long faced accusations of selective blindness during the Holocaust. The rat line extends that shadow into the post-war years. Some historians argue that the Vatican viewed itself as a bulwark against Bolshevism, seeing in fleeing Nazis not war criminals, but instruments of anti-communist resistance. This rationale is supported by declassified MI6 documents from 1948, noting Vatican cooperation in the broader objective of halting Soviet penetration of Western Europe. In the eyes of strategists, moral compromise became a lesser evil when weighed against the spectre of Stalin's Red Army. The Argentine connection cemented the rat line's effectiveness. Juan Perón, president of Argentina, pursued a deliberate policy of welcoming European immigrants, including those with fascist sympathies. Secret agreements between Argentine consuls in Genoa and Barcelona ensured that ships leaving Europe carried more than peasants seeking new lives. Passenger manifests recovered in 1951 reveal false names, yet Allied cryptographers cross-referenced fingerprints, exposing identities such as SS physician Josef Mengele and Luftwaffe ace Hans-Ulrich Rudel. These men established communities in South America, forming enclaves like Colonia Dignidad in Chile and networks in Buenos Aires that funneled funds, ideology, and even weapons into sympathetic regimes. The OSS, and later the CIA, were not passive observers. Project Dolphin, referenced in a 1952 memorandum, documents American monitoring of ratline movements. While some within the agency lobbied for immediate arrests, higher command argued that controlled freedom was preferable. A captured SS intelligence officer could provide insights into Soviet infiltration methods far more valuable than a public trial. Thus, the Vatican corridor became both shield and sieve, allowing fugitives to disappear while feeding information to Western intelligence under discreet supervision. In exchange, the Church gained leverage, portraying itself as indispensable in the ideological war that followed. Yet beneath the layers of geopolitics lies the unspoken human dimension. Survivors of occupied Europe, still mourning massacres in Lidis, Babi Yar, and Oradour-sur-Glane, watched in disbelief as justice was quietly denied. Nuremberg had promised a reckoning, yet for every defendant in the dock, others slipped away under the sign of the cross. The rat line eroded faith in the post-war order, sowing doubts that the Allied victory was a triumph of morality rather than mere strategy. Families searching for accountability were told their tormentors had vanished, presumed dead, while in truth they lived comfortably in villas along the Rio de la Plata. The files remain fragmentary, scattered across archives in Washington, Buenos Aires, and Rome. Many Vatican records remain sealed under papal authority, their opening postponed until decades after the war. Historians granted limited access speak of boxes marked only with cryptic initials, or pages so heavily redacted that entire narratives vanish into black ink. The secrecy fuels speculation that the rat line's reach extended far beyond a handful of fugitives, that entire paramilitary networks were transplanted into South America, later resurfacing during the dirty wars of the 1970s as advisors in torture and counterinsurgency. The story of the Vatican's shadow war network is not merely one of escape, it is one of continuity. By sheltering men responsible for atrocities, the Church and its allies ensured that ideologies of repression survived the war, transplanted into new soils where they would fester. From Argentina's brutal junta to Bolivia's military coups, fingerprints of former SS officers appear repeatedly. Their survival reshaped the trajectory of Latin America, echoing the compromises made in post-war Europe. For the Vatican, silence secured temporary security, but at a cost of moral authority that lingers unresolved. Decades later, as documents surface and survivors demand truth, the rat line remains one of the most enduring symbols of suppressed history. It exposes the fragile line between righteousness and expedience, faith and betrayal. Its corridors were not merely physical paths through mountains and ports, but moral passages where institutions chose power over principle. And in those choices, the true shadow of war lingers, not in battlefields, but in archives sealed with wax and silence. Chapter 2: The Dresden Firestorm Experiments. In February 1945, with the war in Europe nearing its bloody conclusion, the skies above Germany opened with an inferno unlike any other. Dresden, a cultural jewel with limited strategic industry, became the epicenter of one of the most devastating aerial assaults in recorded history. Officially justified as an attempt to cripple German morale and hinder military transportation, the operation carried the codename Thunderclap. Yet, buried in declassified War Cabinet papers and minutes from the British Air Ministry's Blackett Committee, lies evidence suggesting a more sinister dimension. Dresden was selected not merely as a target of war, but as a live experiment in urban annihilation, designed to measure the spread of firestorms, the collapse of civilian psychology, and the efficiency of incineration at scale. The initial strike began on the night of February 13, 1945. More than 770 Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force, guided by Pathfinder aircraft, dropped waves of high explosive ordnance followed by incendiary canisters. American B-17s of the 8th Air Force joined in the subsequent daylight raids, ensuring that survivors who clawed their way from shelters were engulfed in renewed bombardment. Eyewitnesses reported hurricane-force winds, generated by the heat column, pulling oxygen into the city's core as temperatures soared beyond 1,500 degrees Celsius. Entire neighborhoods became roaring furnaces. The death toll, once obscured in propaganda and later minimized in official records, remains contested, with estimates ranging from 25,000 to well above 100,000. But within the archives, the grim obsession was not the number of dead, but the metrics of destruction itself: speed of ignition, density of combustion, and velocity of civilian flight. A heavily redacted memorandum, RAF file D451199, references Dresden as a testbed for thermal cascade. The phrase appears repeatedly, often alongside charts measuring building density and civilian occupancy per square kilometer. It is here that the comparison to Hiroshima becomes unavoidable. Months before the first atomic weapon fell on Japan, Allied planners were studying firestorm behavior as a precursor to gauging the potential of nuclear devastation. The logic was brutal and unspoken. If a city of wooden houses and cultural landmarks could be converted into a laboratory of flames, data could be gathered without admitting its true purpose. Surviving testimonies from Allied airmen describe men in civilian clothing, believed to be government scientists, observing the raids from reconnaissance aircraft, taking notes while the city dissolved into ash below. The war crimes trials at Nuremberg avoided Dresden as a subject. To prosecute the deliberate targeting of civilians risked indicting the victors themselves. Yet documents from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey reveal meticulous analysis of Dresden's aftermath. Photographs catalogue the burn patterns of corpses, noting positions of collapse, clustering around basements, and evidence of asphyxiation before immolation. Reports detailed the speed at which tramlines melted into rivulets of iron, and how shelters converted into ovens once firestorms consumed the oxygen. The data was presented not as humanitarian tragedy, but as scientific result. A ledger of suffering reframed into knowledge. The cold detachment in the language is haunting. Subject response: panic. Mortality ratio: 0.67 in core zones. Thermal spread: optimal. Each line strips humanity into variables, every death a statistic feeding future warfare. In Whitehall, a parallel debate unfolded. Winston Churchill himself, in a note dated March 28, 1945, questioned whether the destruction of German cities simply for the sake of increasing terror had gone too far. Yet the machine of strategic bombing had already outpaced conscience. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command, defended the assault, framing it as necessary to break the enemy's will. But Harris's correspondence, preserved in air staff papers, suggests an underlying awareness that Dresden served a dual purpose: punishment and proof of concept. The city's rail junctions were secondary. The real victory lay in demonstrating that fire could consume a metropolis with surgical efficiency. For survivors, the horror transcended comprehension. In the Altmark Square, thousands sought refuge in underground shelters, only to suffocate as oxygen vanished. Firefighters attempting to pump water into the inferno found their hoses melting in their hands. Civilians attempting escape described tornadoes of fire hurling bodies into the air. Eyewitnesses from the Wehrmacht field hospital spoke of patients bursting into flames on their stretchers. These accounts, suppressed in Allied narratives for decades, survived in German diaries, Soviet investigative reports, and scattered neutral press accounts smuggled past censors. What they collectively describe is not simply destruction, but annihilation by design. The Soviet archives add a chilling layer. Documents from SMERSH, the Red Army's counterintelligence agency, note intercepted Allied transmissions referring to Dresden as a model target. Stalin, upon receiving these reports, publicly condemned the raid as a crime, yet privately viewed it as a demonstration of Western capability, a warning aimed as much at Moscow as at Berlin. Soviet scientists later replicated aspects of Firestorm analysis when constructing their own doctrines of urban warfare. Thus, Dresden became a fulcrum of suspicion, not only a site of tragedy, but of psychological manipulation in the early Cold War. The silence that followed was orchestrated. Official histories reduced Dresden to a military target, focusing on its railways and depots. Photographs of charred civilians, piled in grotesque heaps, were censored or buried. When West German politicians attempted inquiries in the 1950s, they were warned against reopening matters of Allied conduct. The truth remained entombed in archives, its exposure threatening the carefully constructed narrative of liberation and moral clarity. The fragments that leak today paint a picture of wartime pragmatism at its darkest. When victory was near, destruction became experiment. When triumph was assured, terror became test. The memory of Dresden lingers like smoke that never clears. Each discovery of a new file, each testimony preserved against silence, deepens the unease. Was the Firestorm simply vengeance dressed as strategy? Or was it the deliberate use of human beings as unwitting subjects in a grand military experiment? The distinction matters little to those who perished. But to history, it speaks volumes about the cost of victory and the compromises nations make in the pursuit of power. Dresden stands not only as a ruin of war, but as a monument to a truth too incendiary to acknowledge, that the line between weapon and experiment was erased in the flames of February 1945. Chapter 3. Stalin's Secret Pact with the SS. In the official histories of the Second World War, the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, marks the definitive rupture between Nazi Germany and Stalin's USSR. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that cynical agreement of August 1939 dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, was shattered by Operation Barbarossa. From that moment onward, the story we are told is one of absolute enmity, the Soviet Union bleeding, fighting, and eventually triumphing against Hitler's onslaught. Yet among the fragments preserved in captured Abwehr files, decrypted Venona cables, and NKVD interrogation transcripts, there lies evidence that suggests something far more unsettling. Even after the German invasion, elements of the SS and Soviet intelligence explored avenues of covert collaboration. Fragmentary, deniable, and shrouded in silence, under a code name whispered only once in Allied intercepts, Directive Black Lantern. The earliest traces appear in summer 1942, at a time when German armies were pressing towards Stalingrad and Soviet losses mounted catastrophically. Within Abwehrfile No. 2289K, recovered in Prague in 1946, analysts found references to meetings between delegates of Reich Security Main Office and unknown Slavic agents in the ruins of Brest-Litovsk. The language is vague, but later cross-referenced with Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s. One can identify NKVD officer Sergei Kruglov among the intermediaries. His role, officially recorded as liaison on partisan control, appears repeatedly alongside German pseudonyms such as Dr. Adler and Falken. What did these men discuss amid the devastation of occupied Poland? The fragments point to exchanges of technical data, early jet propulsion designs, chemical weapon formulas, and interrogation methods, in return for concessions on prisoner treatment and fuel transfers through neutral intermediaries. The Venona Project, that vast Anglo-American effort to decrypt Soviet communications, provides a further glimpse. Cable 4121, dated November 1943, contains a reference to delivery of lantern material via route delta. Historians long assumed this was a mistranslation, but when paired with Abwehr intercepts mentioning Black Lantern, a disturbing pattern emerges. Information flowed not only eastward, but westward. with both Nazi and Soviet operatives feeding selective intelligence to manipulate the Allied coalition. The Soviets, desperate to accelerate their research in jet technology and nerve agents, may have tolerated clandestine contact with the very regime that had murdered millions of their citizens. To consider such collaboration strains belief, yet circumstantial evidence abounds. Soviet advances in jet propulsion, exemplified by the MiG-9 in 1946, appeared to leapfrog developmental hurdles far faster than their contemporaries. German scientists captured at the close of the war, particularly those connected to the Messerschmitt 262 program, hinted under interrogation that some designs were already in Soviet hands by 1944. Similarly, captured SS records in Nuremberg trial, document 3022 PS note, arrangements for transit of research units to the east. Though no further explanation is provided, were these simply attempts to sow disinformation, or evidence of a temporary, transactional exchange in the grey zone where survival outweighed ideology? The morality of such contact was murky, even by wartime standards. Stalin, ever pragmatic, had already demonstrated his willingness to shift allegiances overnight. His pact with Hitler in 1939 secured him half of Poland and time to rebuild his army. Could it be that even after the betrayal of Barbarossa, he sanctioned covert channels to extract what he needed from his enemies? Within the NKVD's special folder archives lies a memorandum marked "Strictly not to be circulated," dated January 1944, noting that selected Germans were to be escorted to a facility outside Minsk. The names are redacted, but context suggests they were technicians rather than defectors. If true, it means Soviet intelligence knowingly shielded elements of the SS in exchange for knowledge, even as millions of Soviet citizens continued to die on the front lines. Western intelligence caught glimpses of this shadow arrangement, but dared not confront it openly. To expose Stalin's duplicity would have shattered the Grand Alliance when it was most fragile. OSS briefings to Washington in mid-1944 contain cautious language. Reliable, though unverified reports indicate NKVD contact with German units in occupied territory. Motives uncertain. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, committed to sustaining Soviet cooperation until Germany's defeat, chose silence. The files were locked, classified beyond reach, and only resurfaced decades later when fragments trickled out of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Even then, Russian archivists denied the existence of Black Lantern, dismissing it as Western fabrication. Yet secrecy has its own logic. If the Soviets truly extracted German expertise before the Reich's collapse, it explains much of the uncanny parity achieved in early Cold War weapons development. The sudden Soviet mastery of nerve agents, the rapid deployment of swept-wing aircraft, and the eerily familiar designs of early Soviet rockets hint at knowledge too advanced to have been born in isolation. Could this have been the hidden fruit of a clandestine pact with the SS, a trade sealed in blood and silence? The evidence is incomplete, scattered, often contradictory. But in intelligence work, the absence of clarity is itself revealing. The shadow of Black Lantern lingers not only in technical achievements, but in the moral stain it left behind. To acknowledge it would mean admitting that Stalin, hailed as the savior of Europe, was willing to bargain with the very architects of genocide. It would mean that the war's supposed absolutes, good versus evil, fascism versus freedom, were compromised in secret chambers where survival dictated compromise. It would also mean that justice, promised at Nuremberg, was selectively applied. For if some SS officers found their way east under Soviet protection, their crimes were erased, their knowledge recycled, and their victims forgotten. Today, researchers comb through archives in Moscow, Berlin, and Washington, piecing together the fragments. Some files remain sealed, classified indefinitely under the guise of national security. Others have been destroyed, burned in the panic of collapsing regimes. What remains is tantalizing but incomplete, a mosaic missing too many tiles to form a complete picture. Yet even these fragments whisper of a truth too dangerous for its time, that the war between Hitler and Stalin, for all its ferocity, may have contained moments of clandestine convergence, brief pacts in the shadows that history could not afford to acknowledge. The name given to this arrangement, Directive Black Lantern, remains a symbol of this forbidden intersection, where enemies met not as foes, but as conspirators in survival, trading knowledge amid ruins, while the world above believed in absolutes that never truly existed. Chapter 4: Japan's Biological War in Manchuria. the frozen wastelands of Manchuria, far from the front lines of Europe's battles, another war was waged in silence. It was not a war of tanks or bombers, but of laboratories, glass vials, and human subjects reduced to test material. The name of this hidden front was Unit 731, an innocuous designation for one of the most notorious centers of biological warfare ever created. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a decorated officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, the unit operated from a compound near Harbin. Between 1936 and 1945, thousands of civilians, mostly Chinese but also Soviets, Koreans, and Allied prisoners were subjected to experiments that even the most hardened Nazi doctors would have hesitated to conceive. Yet what makes this atrocity more chilling is not only the crimes themselves, but the way they were buried after the war, sealed by the very victors who promised justice at Tokyo and Nuremberg. The architecture of Unit 731 was sprawling, a 150-building complex spanning several square kilometers, disguised as a water purification and epidemic prevention department. Behind its walls, Ishii's men conducted experiments with plague, cholera, anthrax, and frostbite, captured Soviet documents smuggled out during the Khabarovsk trials of 1949, described prisoners tied to wooden posts, while ceramic bombs filled with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, were dropped overhead. Survivors of the initial blast were dissected alive, their organs removed without anesthesia, their deaths recorded with clinical detachment. Laboratory reports labeled with numbers rather than names logged body temperatures, infection progressions, and times of death with mechanical precision. To Ishii, these victims were not people, but maruta, logs, fuel for the advancement of imperial science. Frostbite experiments became a macabre signature of the unit. Prisoners were marched into sub-zero temperatures, their limbs exposed to winter winds until the skin froze solid. Guards then struck the blackened flesh with sticks, listening for the hollow sound of dead tissue. Victims' arms were submerged into boiling water to study thawing effects. The pain reduced to data points in Ishii's notebooks. A declassified US intelligence report, file number 331S, describes photographs of these experiments smuggled out by Soviet investigators. Skeletal figures with limbs swollen and split, eyes glazed with agony, while uniformed doctors looked on, clipboards in hand. These were not aberrations, but systemic practices, conducted daily over nearly a decade. The crimes of Unit 731 extended beyond the laboratory. Entire villages in Manchuria became test sites for biological weapons. Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infested fleas encased in ceramic bombs over Ningbo in 1940, sparking outbreaks that killed thousands. Rivers were seeded with cholera cultures, wells poisoned with typhoid, and food supplies contaminated with anthrax. Each outbreak was carefully documented, the results compiled into reports forwarded to Tokyo. The logic was brutal: war not against armies, but against populations, where disease could cripple resistance without a shot fired. Ishii envisioned biological warfare as the empire's secret weapon, a force capable of paralyzing entire nations. The end of the war should have brought reckoning. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, atrocities from Nanking to Bataan were laid bare. Yet the name Shiro Ishii appeared nowhere in the final indictments. The reason lies buried in memoranda between General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters and US intelligence officers. In September 1945, MacArthur's staff received overtures from Ishii's surviving officers, immunity in exchange for exclusive access to Unit 731's research. A memorandum dated May 6, 1947, stamped top secret and signed by Lincoln Murray Sanders, confirms the deal. The Japanese doctors were never prosecuted. Instead, they were quietly resettled, some returning to academic posts in Japan, others continuing medical careers as if nothing had happened. Their crimes were erased, their data absorbed into American biological warfare programs at Fort Detrick. Maryland, the Soviet Union, denied access to this bargain, staged its own tribunal in Khabarovsk in December 1949. There, 12 members of Unit 731 were tried and convicted. Transcripts of the proceedings, long dismissed in the West as propaganda, revealed detailed accounts of plague bombings and frostbite experiments. Only decades later did Western historians confirm the accuracy of these testimonies. The contrast was stark. While Soviets exposed the crimes, the United States concealed them, ensuring that the knowledge remained classified and exploitable for Cold War purposes. In the balance of geopolitics, Justice was sacrificed on the altar of military advantage. The legacy of Unit 731 seeped quietly into post-war conflicts. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean officials accused the United States of deploying biological weapons. Fleas, insects, and plague-like outbreaks eerily reminiscent of Ishii's methods. Washington denied the charges, branding them Soviet fabrications. Yet fragments of declassified US files suggest field testing of inherited data in East Asia. The evidence is circumstantial, the conclusions contested, but the shadow of Unit 731 hangs over these accusations like a stain that cannot be washed away. The immunity granted to Ishii's men not only absolved them, but integrated their methods into new doctrines of warfare. Even in Japan, silence reigned. Survivors of Manchuria's villages spoke of sudden epidemics and mysterious disappearances, but for decades they were dismissed. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that Japanese journalists and activists forced public recognition of Unit 731's existence. Former soldiers, racked by age and guilt, confessed in recorded testimonies. One described dissecting a 13-year-old girl without anesthesia. Another recalled releasing plague fleas into a well. Their words, trembling and fragmented, confirmed what had long been buried. Yet the Japanese government, while expressing regret, has never issued formal apology or compensation. The archives of Unit 731 remain sealed, their pages yellowing in locked cabinets, deemed too dangerous for release. The moral collapse is staggering. The Allies condemned Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, hanging men like Karl Brandt for human experimentation. Yet Ishii and his colleagues lived unpunished, their crimes washed clean by American secrecy. The victims of Manchuria, their names erased and bodies buried in unmarked pits, never received justice. Instead, their suffering became data, their deaths fuel for laboratories thousands of miles away. The story of Unit 731 is not only about atrocity, but about betrayal. The betrayal of survivors, of justice, and of the very principle that crimes against humanity must never be tolerated. To this day, the remains of Unit 731's compound in Harbin stand as silent witnesses. Concrete foundations, rusted rail lines, and shattered walls lie scattered across fields that once echoed with screams. Tourists walk through reconstructed chambers where dissections were performed, while survivors recount the smell of burning flesh and the sight of smoke rising from crematoria. Yet beneath the memorial lies an unresolved truth. The full extent of Unit 731's legacy remains classified, buried in Pentagon vaults, locked in Japanese ministries, and withheld by governments unwilling to confront their complicity. Until those files are opened, the story of Japan's biological war in Manchuria will remain incomplete. A forbidden chapter of history whispered only in fragments, carried by the silence of the dead. History is often written as a clean ledger of victories and defeats, but the deeper one digs into the sealed files of World War II, the more that ledger begins to blur. The four shadows we have followed, from the Vatican corridors that sheltered war criminals, to the Dresden Inferno repurposed as a laboratory of terror, to Stalin's whispered negotiations with his supposed mortal enemies, and finally the grotesque silence surrounding Japan's biological war, do not exist as isolated episodes. They are fragments of a larger truth, that the war was not only fought with tanks, rifles, and bombs, but with moral compromises and secret bargains that shaped the world which followed. Each revelation undermines the official narratives, the comforting myths of good and evil, and instead exposes a terrain of grey where expedience outweighed principle. The Vatican saw in Nazi fugitives not criminals, but weapons against communism. Allied air forces transformed a city into a firestorm experiment. Its people rendered data points in the calculus of destruction. Stalin, the sworn enemy of fascism, may have traded in secrets with the very architects of genocide. And in Manchuria, the United States itself buried atrocity to harvest the science of death. These secrets were sealed not because they were untrue, but because they were too dangerous to admit, too destabilizing for the order that emerged in 1945. As archives continue to open and fragments surface, one must ask, how many more corridors of silence remain untouched? How many more truths lie waiting in the locked vaults of history?